What stories about WW2 did your grandparents tell you, and or what did you find out about their lives during that period? My grandpa very rarely talked about it, but he was in the Pacific in WW2. He caught malaria and was sent to a hospital ship to recover, and the Japanese sunk the ship. So he floated for like 10 hours clinging to the wreckage with active malaria before finally being rescued. And after all that, he re-enlisted and fought in the Korean War also. What a badass. It is honestly crazy to think how badass some people are in real life. And here I am, practically in tears, because my legs went numb on the toilet, and they got all tingly when I stood up. One grandfather was in the AIF, fighting in the jungles of Papua New Guinea on the infamous Kokoda track. He had nightmares about his experiences for the duration of his life and only spoke about it to me briefly when I was a kid. He mentioned that he would often cut his own path through the thick jungle because the Japanese would hide up in the trees and ambush them. He wasn't a fan of the bully beef and was constantly soaked through due to torrential rain and mud. He never smoked, but would win cigarettes off his mates in card games, then light them and hang them from the entrance to his tent to help keep the swarms of mosquitoes away. He also coldly told me that the Japanese killed all his friends. He helped build some of the jungle runways for the American planes to later land. He said that, once the Americans came, things began to improve. My other grandfather was in the Royal Navy, in the Arctic convoys, delivering much needed supplies to the Russians in Murmansk. Winston Churchill described the convoys as the worst journey in the world. My grandfather initially put his life jacket on as trained to do, when one of the older sailors laughed and told him, "Don't worry about it, son, you'll freeze to death in under a minute anyway." They'd often have to chip away the thick ice on ships to prevent them capsizing. His ship was involved in numerous battles against larger, heavier armed German ships, as well as U-boats and planes. He told me how his ship had to use its last remaining torpedo to scuttle fellow crippled Royal Navy ship, HMS Edinburgh, which was carrying heaps of gold bullion from Stalin, to prevent it slipping into enemy hands. The gold was salvaged in the 1980s. My grandfather befriended a German family during the war. They would cook him meals, and the mother would wash his clothes. One day he loaded up a box with eggs and used toilet paper to make sure they didn't break. The next day there was a note in his laundry thanking him for the eggs, but an even bigger thank you for the toilet paper. They hadn't had any in years. I had a great uncle who was part of the occupying forces in Germany. He loved dogs and purchased a full-blooded German Shepherd while overseas. He couldn't keep the dog with him, so he had a German family look after the dogs. Meat was hard to come by, so every week or so, my uncle would bring the family meat to feed the dog. It was only after getting the dog home my uncle discovered the dog absolutely loved sauerkraut and didn't quite know what to do with the meat. It turns out the German family was taking the meat for the dog and eating it themselves and feeding the dog sauerkraut. I wouldn't blame them. They didn't know that they had to keep the goose that laid the golden eggs alive though. But who are we kidding? It's a German Shepherd, it's gotta love sauerkraut. He loaded up a box with eggs and used toilet paper. Yeah, it took me a moment as to why would someone thank you for giving them shit-stained eggs. Grandfather was drafted, broke his femur in basic training. Spent the entirety of WWII behind a desk in Oklahoma processing logistics and supply chain management requests. My grandpa had a similar accident. Was sent to Berlin. Happened to be working on the roof, and someone forgot he was up there, and moved the ladder. He slipped, snapped a tendon, and wound up being trained as a medical assistant. Unfortunately, this meant he saw a lot of bad stuff, including having to treat a good friend who then died. He suffered from PTSD and depression the rest of his life, but was a wonderful grandpa. He had trouble talking about the war, so rarely did. While he was in Berlin, he fell in love with a German girl, and asked her father for permission to marry her. He was told no, because not only was he American, but he was Italian, which was even worse to the father. After the war, he stayed in Germany for 2 years, to help clean up. He said the people were nice. He never had anything bad to say about them. But that's kind of how he was. I think maybe that came from growing up around criminals and understanding people can be both good and bad. His family was in the Mafia, and ran a front in Brooklyn, and prior to that, a brothel. He went to Pratt, when it was still affordable, so he could become an engineer. He went on to become an aerospace engineer, and was a talented woodworker. His grandpa was a woodworker, who sold his furniture on the side. He married my grandma, taking in her 2 kids. They bought a house using the GI Bill. Then they had my mom. They were together for 46 years. He survived cancer 3 times. He lived to be 86. It's been 8 years since he passed, and we all still really miss him. His favorite cartoon to watch with me was Hey Arnold, because it reminded him of Brooklyn, and he used to tell me about the homing pigeons he trained on his roof, just like Pigeon Man. My grandfather would talk about the training time with his unit while being transported, but mostly about a little kid he was helping feed in China after Japan surrendering. He would just think aloud about what happened to him, and if he was alright. He never talked about combat. I did walk into his house once, and the History Channel was on showing a USMC graveyard on Okinawa, and he was crying. My great-grandfather served in the Leningrad militia during its siege. Leningrad is now known as St. Petersburg. The Nazis severed off the city's supply lines and bombed their food storages. The blockade lasted 900 days, and the citizens basically just farmed wherever they could, while the militia combined with the Red Army held off the Nazis. The daily ration was a small piece of bread. Many people died from starvation. Everyone had a meal ticket, which you needed to receive your ration. People would steal these, and if you lost your ticket, you would lose your rations for the rest of the month. Many people died from starvation, and there were rumors of cannibalism. My great-grandpa was a scout/messenger, and he nearly died to either a bomb or a mine. After that, he received a medical discharge, but remained in the city of Leningrad. When the blockade finally ended, he weighed 39 kilograms. Scary stuff. My grandfather joined up in 1943, when he turned 18 years old. He was stationed on a Pacific island, where he basically became a radar O'Reilly. His family were Mennonites, so he was a conscientious objector. He was a medic, clerical worker, cook, ditch digger, driver, and anything else that he was asked. Most of his time was spent cleaning up after everyone else, and watching for air raids by the Japanese Air Force. Edit. My mom said that he watched the Japanese planes surrender on the US Missouri. My granduncle was part of a cleanup crew in Japan after the Battle of Leyte. So after all the fighting was done, they'd send his unit in to clear out the bodies of the fallen Japanese. He said that they would loot their bodies, take treasures like knives, swords, gold off the teeth, and then put their bodies on a giant landing craft, the kind that open up on a beach, and take them out to sea to dispose of them. He says he'll never forget watching the sharks just go to town on the dead. Haunts him to this day. Edit. This was in Philippines, not Japan. But it was a battle against the Japanese. My great-grandfather never talked about the war until he had his stroke. We knew he had a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, but we didn't know how he got them. He was just a private, and he'd had enough of the military when the war was over. After the stroke, he seemed to loosen up. He laughed about sighting rifles in by shooting at chickens. He showed us pictures of him in front of the Eiffel Tower. Turns out he was occupation force. Ended up occupying an area near Berlin that became involved in the Battle of the Bulge. Apparently, while he was fighting, some sort of explosive blew off his buddy's leg, so Grandpa did what anyone else would do, and threw his buddy over his shoulder to get him to the med tent. This included running across a field in the line of sight of a German machine gun nest. He was shot in the leg and some more shrapnel ended up in his chest. Somehow, Grandpa and his buddy survived. We thought he was embellishing it, but the Bronze Star paperwork included a report that we found after he passed away. 2 higher-ups signed that the story was true, so I guess I have to believe it. He told us it wasn't that big of a deal, and that he didn't deserve all those medals for what he did. What a badass. R.I.P. Gramps. Edit. Words. Edit 2. People are pointing out that this battle didn't happen in Berlin. He never said Berlin, just Germany. I said Berlin because I'm not good at history. Sorry.